Um, what I'm going to be presenting is a squashed version of a 90-page paper I wrote, finished writing. And so obviously I'm not going to get everything, and I am conscious of time. But I need to say, first off, that none of this would have happened. I'll just put this a little closer. There we go. So for the last number of years, I've been trying to complete a degree in history from a university online. And when I got my BA, I thought, I'm never going back to school. I couldn't think of any reason why I would ever want to. But when something comes along, it's kind of like when you're hungry, you know, and the right thing comes along, and, you know, if you're only a little hungry, it's like, oh, there goes that item. I'm not interested. Oh, there's there's an apple. I'm not terribly interested. I like apples, you know. But sometimes something will come along and you're not super hungry, but you're like, oh, okay, well, yes, I'll eat that. So this is kind of like, that's kind of like this. So the Hyksos, whenever I put the word Hyksos into a word processor, it always flags it. This word is spelled wrong. The spell check never knows what this word is. And a couple of years ago, Brian and I were writing a book together, and it was about what would happen.
If you can get that light off of the screen, it'll show up better on your video.
How do we do that? They'll do it. So, right. Okay, good deal. So a couple years ago, Brian and I were writing a book about somebody spending a day in heaven, what they would see, who they would meet, and so part of the book was about heaven, and before starting this book, I had wanted to write a book about Egypt. Well, one day, Brian and I had a really good idea. We'll make it about heaven and about Egypt. But the more I studied about, and so I wrote, Brian and I, together, we wrote about 10 chapters. But I started discovering that I knew so little about history. And I was so interested in Egypt, but what I read from other professional writers, well, the long and the short of it is that it made me decide to get a history degree. The last few weeks have been very interesting, but I know that people have prayed for me, and I appreciate it. 2 weeks ago, I accidentally drank something that was pretty much lethal, but fortunately, it didn't cause me a problem. And a week ago, I broke several toes, so I was really happy when Jenny took over. So, anyways, let's go ahead and go into this. The other day, Brian and I were having a conversation. This was more like a month and a half ago. Brian and I were having a conversation, and Brian said to me, you know that Joshua, that wasn't his real name. I didn't know that. Huh? But that's what, I didn't put the verse on here. Okay, Joshua 1:9, excuse me. Basically, there's, and I should have it up here, there's a place in Genesis where it's talking about the 12 spies. Actually, it's Exodus, excuse me. And it's talking about the spies from each individual tribe. And it ends with Joshua, the son of Nun. And it says that Moses, his name was Hoshea, but Moses called him Joshua. So Joshua was a faithful leader. It was Joshua who said in Joshua 24:15, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And Joshua and Caleb were both faithful leaders. But Joshua was also a Hyksos descendant. And I never heard this word Hyksos except for until about 2 years ago. Most people have never heard the word at all. It's kind of an obscure word. What are Hyksos? So there were four great world powers. There were four powers that ruled Egypt. There were the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, and the Hyksos. These four powers ruled the land of the pharaohs. How could Joshua be a Hyksos? Egypt is a very interesting place. It's a shadow of a shell of its ancient former glory. And when I was in Egypt earlier this year, I had a lot of weird things happen. I ended up walking much further than I wanted in the city of Cairo because I got out of a taxi because I didn't feel safe in it. Anyways, and I've been to Cairo and I've been to Luxor. I haven't been to Alexandria. So this painting you see at the bottom is actually a tomb carving at a place about 200 miles south of Cairo. And these are supposedly what the Hyksos looked like. I have my doubts, but there's no other painting or tomb carving that helps us to know what they were like. So there are three questions that historians ask about the Hyksos. Who were they? Where did they come from? And where did they go? And most scholars don't answer these questions. In fact, just one or two maybe give some detail, but not much. So in history, if you've ever put together a puzzle and you're looking and there's a piece missing, well, that's like history. You know, there are a lot of things in history that people have forgotten or that have been lost. It's just the way it is. And Egypt, this is especially true because their history is so long. And there are just many things that we don't know. So the Hyksos ruled 3,500 years ago. It doesn't make them very easy to relate to, does it? 1550 BC, they were defeated by the 18th dynasty by a guy named Pharaoh Amos. And there is so little information about the Hyksos in history. But my studies have shown that they were the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, in history, you have the Hyksos and you have the Israelites. Some websites on the internet will say that the Hyksos were the Israelites, and they were close, but there are too many, it creates more questions than answers. And my research shows that the Hyksos were the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. And the Hyksos didn't rule just Egypt. They ruled parts of Palestine as well. And let's go to the next one. So there is a lot of missing information on the Hyksos. You have their names. That they have in some museums, like a seal, like a ring with it's like a signature. But very little. Hyksos artifacts have been found in modern Turkey, in the island of Crete, northern Syria, in Baghdad, in Iraq. The Hyksos, their talent was economics. They were very good at making money, and they were very good at trade. But there's so little information about them. Ramses II is the traditional antagonist or villain in the story of the Exodus. And he lived about 100 years before the Exodus took place.
That doesn't match up very well.
Yeah, it doesn't match up well at all. Hollywood is always certain that Ramses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. There's no way to know whether this would have made him delighted or vexed. And this museum you see here is the Grand Egyptian Museum. The Louvre Museum in Paris has been the world's largest museum for, I don't actually know, but it's about to lose its crown to the Grand Egyptian Museum. And that museum is huge. And I'm sorry I don't have any pictures that I took when I was there. But you could spend a whole day in that place. Anyways, there is so much that's been lost to history. So there are certain people who lived long ago who tell us interesting things. So a lot of you have heard of a guy named Josephus. He took the name Flavius, which is a Roman name, and he was, tradition has it that when the Romans took Jerusalem, that Josephus was outside the walls pleading for the Jewish leaders to accept surrender. Of course, they didn't. Josephus claims that the Hyksos were the forefathers, his forefathers, and the forefathers of the Israelites. This is a yes and no answer, because the Israelites themselves were not the Hyksos, but the Hyksos were the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. But of course, the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh were half Egyptian. And Josephus mentions that the Hyksos were freed by the events of the Exodus, just as the Israelites were. So I have studied this for quite some time. I've looked on the internet. I have not found any group or person that has said that Ephraim and Manasseh were the descendants of that Ephraim and Manasseh were the forefathers of the Hyksos. I've looked, I haven't found anybody who has said that. I've encountered people who have come close, but they haven't said, they actually haven't, there is not that connection. A lot of people who say that the Israelites were the Hyksos. Manetho was a priest. He was an Egyptian, but he could speak Greek, he could write ancient Egyptian and modern Greek, and his book, Egyptia, is lost. But parts of his book are in Josephus's book, this book here, you see. If it dropped on somebody, it would cause problems. It's a big book.
There's supposed to be a picture of that up there?
Well, the central picture is a painting of Ephraim and Manasseh. To the right, that's what some historians believe that Manetho looked like. And of course, the gentleman in the turban, that's supposedly what Josephus looked like. Now, this priest here, the guy on the left, who doesn't look very happy, now that could just be a representation of an Egyptian priest. Manetho claimed, the historian, that the Hyksos raised temples and burned down buildings and towns. He says a lot more, and he definitely does not like the Hyksos. He says that the Hyksos eventually settled in Jerusalem, in Judea, near Jerusalem, which is interesting because that's where the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh settled. Manetho also mentions, the Hyksos claimed in their sacred literature that they had been slaves. So we have the Israelites who were slaves, and the Hyksos who claimed to have been slaves. So I'm still looking for a claim on the internet like mine that Ephraim and Manasseh were the forefathers of the Hyksos, but I haven't found it yet. I'm still looking. So the Hyksos, they were strangers, rulers, and slaves during their 400 sojourn in ancient Egypt. The Hyksos were conquered by the 18th dynasty, which is the dynasty of Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun, most of us know, his tomb was discovered in 1922, Hold on just a moment. Excuse me, I didn't drink enough water this morning. So in 1922, Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered by an archaeologist named Howard Carter. And it is probably the world's most important archaeological finding. 400 years. The correlations between the Hyksos and another ancient record is very interesting. So the 400 years covers dynasty 12 to 18. That's about the space of 400, 500 years. And they were strangers, rulers, and slaves. So what would it mean if all of these three of the questions of their origin, their destination, and their identity, what would it mean if those questions could be answered? It would have amazing implications for a lot of Egyptian history. So we have in history, we have primary sources and we have secondary sources. A primary source is somebody who saw the event and recorded it. A secondary source would be a person who wrote about what happened but were not alive at the time. So if I used people as primary sources, this project would have failed. Because there is the biblical record that talks about that time. But aside from the biblical record, there's almost nothing. A lot of artifacts. But I found out a certain helpful piece of information. One of my professors told me, Brent, if you have an artifact that you can prove is from a certain time, and it's mentioned in a scholarly journal, you can use it as a primary source. And when I found that out, well, I still didn't have as many primary sources as I wanted to, but yeah. So I was very fortunate, and I was going to bring it and show it to you, but I forgot. There's a book called Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos, Recent Excavations at Tel El Daba, which is in the northeastern part of the Nile Delta in Egypt. And a lot of very interesting discoveries were made at this place. This is by a guy named Manfred the Tech. He's from the University of Vienna in Austria. They did some excavations in this place and came up with a lot of very interesting information. They found a statue that had been almost 9 feet tall. It was a seated statue. And this statue had, there was one big statue, but they found another bust that was very similar. This statue is of a person who's not Egyptian, not royalty. And in Egypt, pretty much the only statues are of royalty. It's very rare that a large statue would be made of somebody who was not royalty, but this was maybe the largest statue in Egypt of somebody who's not royalty. This person had red hair. They painted him like Egyptians paint foreigners. And you can see that his haircut is rather unusual. It's kind of a mushroom-shaped haircut. Now, they only found fragments of this statue, but they found enough to know how tall it was. This statue was wearing a coat of colors. It had a throw stick. He's holding a throw stick. It's kind of like not exactly a scepter, but something like that. And it was a mark and a symbol of authority. In this area of Avaris, it's about, the excavation site is about 8 miles in circumference. They found many, many bones of animals, but no pig bones, none. There were many bones of sheep and cows and donkeys and goats, but no pig bones. They found 11 other tombs in the immediate area. Everything they found at this reminds us of the Israelites. So, because part of my presentation of my argument is based on this book. Something else that is a primary source, that is another source, are scarabs. So, in a lot of museums, like the Met in New York City, I haven't been there. They have a lot of scarabs, which were kind of used as rings. If you're going to buy something today and you use your credit card or debit card or whatever, you have to use your signature. And a scarab was kind of like a signature. But these scarabs have been found in Turkey. They've been found in modern Iraq, northern Syria, the island of Crete. These Hyksos traveled a lot, and they were into business. And ancient records show that Avaris was an international hub of trading. Now it's all desert, but in Avaris there is evidence that a large branch of the Nile flowed through that area. So, there is a lot of archaeology that ties the Hyksos to the Israelites and Ephraim and Manasseh. So in the top here, you can see there's a picture of a tomb, and those things that you see there are lights, I believe. This was the biographical tomb carving of a soldier whose name was Amos, the same name as the Pharaoh at the time. And it was the ambition of a lot of these soldiers and nobility of Egypt to have a large tomb cut out for the afterlife, because they all believed that their mummy would rest in the tomb and that their spirit would come back to the mummy because that's where it liked to be. How they knew this, I don't know. And this man records what he did in his life. Yes?
What was that scripture that talked in French, was it Chronicles, that talked about the descendants were in Egypt a long time?
Yes.
You had in the previous slides.
Oh, thank you. I forgot that. Okay, so so in Chronicles 7:20 through 29, it mentions that the sons of Ephraim went outside of Egypt, particularly in southern Israel, and that two of them tried to take cattle from the Philistines, and the Philistines killed them. But Chronicles 7 tells us one thing, that the 400 years were literal. They were not figurative. And Chronicles 7:20 through 29 lets us know that the children of Ephraim, they traveled quite a bit. In fact, his daughter built Upper and Lower Beth Huron, which were some towns near Jerusalem, or what would become Jerusalem. And many years later, after the Exodus, the children of Ephraim, or the descendants rather, they settled in that area again. Now, I have concentrated on the basics as much as I possibly could, but I couldn't help wondering myself, well, God made this promise, or God explains to Abraham that his descendants would be slaves and strangers in a land that are not their own for 400 years. And it seems probable that Ephraim and Manasseh and all of them would know about this prophecy. So it's possible that they were trying to prevent the inevitable, which would be enslavement. And of course, that's what happened. So this soldier talks about an attack on Avaris. So the Hyksos ruled for about 100 years, 150 years, about 70 years after Joseph died. And they were part of, there were several dynasties. There's the 18th dynasty, which is very famous because of Tutankhamun. Then you have the 17th, which was the precursor. But you had dynasties 16, 15, 14, and 13. And the Hyksos, they controlled dynasties 16 and 15. So in a sense, they had their own nations. And some of the nobility of Egypt were upset about this. Of course, it had been a long time since Joseph had lived, and much of what he had done for Egypt had been forgotten. And one guy named Hyksos was upset. He said, I sit here in Egypt, and up north in Avaris reigns somebody that controls part of Egypt, and down south, somebody reigns in Kush, modern-day Sudan. That person controls part of Egypt. And the priests and Hyksos said that the priests of Amun directed him to destroy the Hyksos and defeat Kush. That's exactly what happened. And the Hyksos, they were economically very talented, and they had a military, but their military was not as advanced as the 17th dynasty, which would become the 18th dynasty. And in the bottom, you can see it says stela. A stela is like a monument where a conqueror boasts, oh, look what I did. I defeated those guys. You know? And so there are stelas all over Egypt from one pharaoh or another who said, I conquered these people. I conquered those people. And this is a stela by Hyksos about conquering the Hyksos. Now, he didn't completely conquer them. He came close. His younger brother, Amos, did conquer them. The biographical tomb carvings talk about an attack on Avaris. It talks about the defeat of Avaris. It talks about how the slaves were taken, gold was given, and how people were killed. So a lot of this information, it kind of sets up an understanding for why the Israelites were enslaved. James Henry Breasted is a guy who wrote about ancient Egypt, and he wrote particularly about the Hyksos religion. The Hyksos were monotheists. They only believed in worshiping one God. And he records that the Hyksos built a temple that was painted blue and that was dedicated to a cosmic god. This is in an area where there are many bones of stock animals found, but no pig bones. After a while, you can't say a coincidence for so long. So you have 400 years from the 12th dynasty ruler, Amenemhet III, until the 18th dynasty ruler, Thutmose III. The statues of Amenemhet III all look the same. They pretty much look the same. Now this one is very well preserved, of course. The statues of Thutmose III, none of them look alike. They're all different. And they don't look anything like his mummy, of course. Genesis 15:13 is a prophecy about how Abraham's descendants would be strangers and slaves for 400 years in Egypt, in a land not their own. And in Genesis 48:17-20, that is the part in the Bible in Genesis where Jacob is about to die, and he calls for Joseph and his two half-Egyptian grandsons. And he says, in essence, that Manasseh would be great, but Ephraim would be greater. And Jacob says that countries and nations would come out of Ephraim. And there is a lot of archaeological evidence that the 15th and 16th dynasties were Hyksos rulers descended from Ephraim. So you have the Pharaoh who elevated Joseph, Amenemhet III. You have the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Moses III. And in the middle, you have a group of people that most historians say almost nothing about, but that are at the same time as the Israelites. Now, they're not the Israelites. They are the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. The Hyksos, they were highly Egyptianized. They did wear beards, but they had some Egyptian names. And like the statue that we looked at earlier, they had been highly Egyptianized. So there are a lot of implications, and I can't go over all of the sources with you because we just don't have the time. I have about 30 sources so far. By the time of the 18th dynasty, a lot of people in Egypt would have forgotten what Joseph had done. There is the daughter the Bible mentions the daughter of Pharaoh. All the evidence points to her being Hatshepsut. And I'm sorry, I meant to include a picture. In Egypt, there's a very beautiful building that's 3,500 years old. And modern archaeologists have had to do some repair, but it looks basically like it did then. And it's a very large mortuary temple. And when I went to that temple, I was looking for anything at all that might have to do with Moses. Because the information all points to this Hatshepsut being the Egyptian stepmother of Moses. And so I looked all around this temple, and there are hieroglyphs everywhere, carvings everywhere. But interestingly, many of them are chiseled out. And in fact, almost half of them are chiseled out. And so I couldn't find anything at that temple that was a link to Moses. But the timelines match up.
Can you explain why they were chiseled out, why they would do that?
Well, when a new dynasty comes along, they are not kind to the dynasty before. So, the person who followed Hatshepsut was what they call the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. And he fought 17 major battles. He didn't lose one. History doesn't tell us how he died. But he didn't lose any battles. He was the stepson of Hatshepsut, of the woman in the middle. And there was a power struggle. So, in the 18th dynasty, they had a lot of problems with succession, finding able rulers to follow them. And in one case, a pharaoh had a daughter, but no legitimate sons. And the decision was then made that she would marry a half brother in essence. And that's just gross, but in that time and that place, it was kind of the norm because preserving the dynasty was the most important thing they felt they could do. And so...
Abraham married his half-sister.
Say again?
Abraham married a half-sister.
Yeah. There are indications that she was a Hittite. But yeah, he did, and it was kind of the norm. And so you kind of feel sorry for this poor girl. We speculate she could have been anywhere from 12 to 15. Naturally, she wouldn't want to marry her stepbrother, but she couldn't get married in order to have an heir. So what happens?
Wasn't he younger than she was?
That is a good possibility, yes. there is a very good possibility that the stepbrother was younger than her. And he didn't, history doesn't tell us a lot about him. So she goes to the Nile River one day because the Egyptians bathe frequently. And, you can only wonder what's going through her head for several years. This is just awful. I have to marry this stepbrother of mine. I sure wish there was some way out of it. And, of course, this is speculating. But she comes down to the Nile, and there in a basket is a baby on the water. So what does she do? She thinks, this is the solution to all my problems. If she had an heir, she would keep her power. She would have to marry her stepbrother inevitably, but she would have an heir. And what would she do to protect her heir? She would give him a name that was partly like her father, Tutmosis the first. And she would say, I drew him out of the water. If somebody said, you can't claim that baby as your heir, she could have the perfect response. The God sent him on the river to me. And the archaeological evidence shows that she and her father were very close. So she was able to preserve her power. The only thing that could threaten her power was if her heir committed a grievous sin, an offense. And Egyptian history doesn't say anything about that, but the Bible does. And so she does lose her power, but only after she had ruled for quite some time. And she was able to keep her power and name until she died. And this picture on the top, it's not a very good one, is a representation, digitization of her mummy.
It's better than a lot of the others.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I decided not to put any pictures of mummies in any of my slides. The first time I went to look at mummies, I was kind of a little queasy. But the second time, I didn't have a problem with it. And the people would tell me, hey, you're in here too long, you got to keep going. But I had paid, and I was going to. So, for most of my academic journey, it was my hypothesis that the Hyksos were the Israelites. That's what I believed. And before I go into that, Joshua, a Hyksos descendant, led the Israelites into the promised land around the same time as Tutankhamun. And the Bible says that the third generation of an Egyptian and an Edomite could enter into the assembly of the children of Israel, which makes sense, because so many of the Hyksos, Egyptians, would have been descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh and Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. Let's see here. So, quick story. This picture that you see up on the top right, I was in this happened in 2021. It was a Sunday, and I was in Seoul going to a place called Itaewon to buy some food, to buy some foreign food. Because in Itaewon, there are a lot of foreign food shops, and you could buy cereal and stuff that Korean stores didn't sell. And I was at a station waiting to get on the subway. And I hear my phone ring, and, it's Kathy. It's like, hello, dear. And we talked a little while, and Kathy said, Brent, what are you doing? She was in Oregon at that time. I'm going to Itaewon. I'm at Samgachi, which is about 2 miles away. And Kathy said, Brent, you should walk to Itaewon. And I talked about, okay, I'll walk to Itaewon. So I got out of the station and I started walking to Itaewon. About that time, it was about the beginning of my interest in Egypt. But I was thinking I was walking, I'm so interested in Egypt, but where am I going to find a museum about Egypt that has Egyptian artifacts? And I'm thinking this, and I'm walking a little further, and I look up, And there is a very large museum in Seoul called the Korean War Memorial Museum. But a certain section of the exhibit hall was given over to Egyptian artifacts. And I look across this, I'm walking this way. I look this way, and there's this very large sign about Egypt. And I had been thinking about Egypt, and I was like, how does stuff like this happen? So I thought, well, I'll buy food later. I went straight to the museum, paid the fee, and took a bunch of pictures. And that's one of the cards I got from it. In a lot of ways, I feel like the Lord has led me, but I'll try to finish up here. I had a theory that the Israelites were the Hyksos. When I prayed about it and asked God, to show me if that was true. Around December, I came to the conclusion that my theory was wrong. The Israelites couldn't have been the Hyksos. It created more questions than answers. And I was kind of bummed because I was like, I'm finishing my degree. Now I can't use my main theory. What am I going to do? And I was worried. And so, but I had already scheduled a flight to Egypt in early December 2023. So I went to Egypt, and I've been to Egypt twice. The first time it was very easy because I have a very good friend who worked as a canvasser there. And he said, oh, Brent, stay with me, it's no problem. Second time, my friend didn't live there. So I emailed everybody I could. Is there a place I can stay? Everybody said no. I tried everything I possibly could. It just seemed like a closed door. But I kept praying and I kept trying. And somebody I didn't know, I had seen them, but I didn't know them, said, well, you should call so-and-so in the Seventh-day Adventist conference in Egypt. And so okay, and I had seen this person, I didn't really know them. I had made a Facebook post. So I contacted the person she gave me contact for. They gave me the contact to somebody else, and somebody else wrote me and said, hey, Brent, there's a free place you can stay in Cairo, a free place. So, okay. So I went there, but the problem about, my paper was still a problem. I couldn't say that the Israelites were the Hyksos. So I went to Egypt, and I went to museums during the day, and at night, I sat in the place I was staying thinking, well, who were they? And so I was praying, and I was asking the Lord, and I started reading this book of Varus. And about a couple days after I got there in the evening, I had this thought, what if the Hyksos were the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh? And I'm like, oh, what a thought. So, so I was reading this book, and I was thinking about what I had studied, and ever since then, everything has kind of fallen into place. And I haven't really encountered any obstacles to that idea of the Israelites, of the Hyksos being the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. The timelines worked out, the familial relations worked out, and I now had a topic I could make my final paper on. I haven't shared this in public. This is the first time, so I'm a little scattered. So, I feel kind of undeserving, it's why didn't an archaeologist or historian before me make this connection? But, God not only gives us knowledge of lost history, which to me is very interesting. Historians need to be like storytellers. But so often, historians are people who put you to sleep. And so history has to be dynamic and interesting. And anyways, what's that?
Just like the Bible.
Yes, exactly. So So it's my belief that God has given me some lost history.
Amen.
And, but, you know, something more amazing and wonderful is that God has given us knowledge that's worth having. You know, and in the bottom you can see, above the main point, the statue of Tutmosis III, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. His mummy bears signs that he drowned. And his son, Amenhotep II, is covered with scars, boils. What kind of plague would cause that? And the Israelites may have thought, because Tutmosis III was the mightiest pharaoh up to that point, in some ways he was a greater conqueror than Ramses II. And they might have thought, how are we ever going to get out from under the thumb of this tyrant? You know, and they may have been tempted to think, well, how can God ever deliver us from this guy? But of course God did in a miraculous and wonderful way. And sometimes we think, you know, how is God going to deliver us from this tyrant, this cruel tyrant, the enemy of souls? But God is able. We need to take him at his word and trust him and keep the Bible as our guide, using it to remind us constantly that God will deliver us. So, anyways, I guess that's the last slide.